In this video you will learn all relevant additions to V-Ray 6. We will check out following new features. The Finite Dome light that helps with integration of 3D models in spherical environments. The support for clouds in the V-Ray Sky for much more believable skies. The 𝐘𝐨𝐬 plugin that can distribute vegetation procedurally. The new 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬 modifier that can replace surfaces with complex geometry. And displacement texture support for V-Ray Decals. We'll also check out shader-related improvements such as the enhanced subsurface scattering in the V-Ray material, the new thin film option to generate various interesting effects, and a new energy preservation model that renders rough shaders now much more realistic. Finally, we will check out some frame buffer improvements such as the proportion guide feature for better composition of your images, the Panorama Viewer that simplifies the work with spherical panoramas, and the new collaboration feature that allows for sharing and commenting of your images. Let's first check out the new Finite Dome option here in the V-Ray Dome light. And this one was added to address certain kind of issues with the traditional dome light. Let me first show you briefly what those problems were so that you can understand why this new Finite Dome option here was added. So in this scene we're using the dome light not only to illuminate our car, but also to be fully visible as the whole environment itself. In this kind of situation we easily run into problems. For example, if I zoom out, and you notice the environment, it's not really changing at all. The only thing that seems to be changing is the car here itself. Also, if we rotate around in our scene, you will notice that the car seems to be sliding here over the ground plane. And in order to fix that, there's traditionally this ground projection mode, and this can address the issue that the car is floating over the floor. But if we try to zoom out again, you will notice that only the floor seems to be reacting correctly to the camera movement, and the upper part of the dome is still infinitely far away. Also, it creates this really weird transition between the upper and the lower part. And in this kind of situations, the traditional dome light doesn't really offer a good enough solution to integrate our subject into the environment in a believable way that works from all kind of different camera angles. And since those problems are caused by parts of the dome light being infinitely far away from the camera, the new Finite Dome option can solve these kind of issues. In order for it to work, we first need to disable our ground projection in the V-Ray bitmap and then enable this new Finite Dome option in here. So you can see now the dome light has a scaling and position in the scene, and I can, for example, move it around. But let's first position it firmly on the ground plane so that our car is in our dome light. Then we can make it a little bit bigger, for example 500 centimeters, then also zoom back a little bit in order to understand what is going on here. So with the radius we can determine the size of our finite dome. The projection height will determine how our ground plane here will be projected. And at the moment you can see there's some kind of stretching. So if we raise this a little bit, we will kind of address that, for example, to a value of 100. And then the ground plane determines the transition between the ground plane and the upper part of the dome. And we can make it, for example, more smooth if we want to. So now let's just increase the radius of our finite dome in order to make our environment a little bit bigger. And with the new radius, we also might need to increase our projection height to get rid of the stretching on the floor. So now when I zoom into my scene and you check out what's happening in the background, you will see that as it's not infinitely far away anymore, it reacts correctly to the position of the camera, and you can render any kind of angle now, and you will always get a kind of believable result. And all in all, this new Finite Dome option offers a really good way to believably integrate some models into a spherical HDRI, and you can use those results for look dev or even for final rendering. Another great feature in V-Ray 6 is that now there is the possibility to add clouds to your skies if you're using a VRaySun&Sky system. And this scene is using this kind of sun-and-sky system. So you can see the sky is defined by my sun position in the scene. And then in the sun, you can now enable the procedural clouds. So now my before a little bit boring looking sky has these kind of interesting clouds, and they are fully integrated into the VRaySun&Sky system. So no matter where I position my sun, the clouds will always react correctly to the sun position. Also, they don't seem to add any kind of noticeable increase in render time, so there's really no downside in using them. There are a bunch of parameters to define the look of your clouds. Let's briefly go through some of them. So with the density, you can increase or decrease the amount of clouds. So let's add, for example, more clouds or reduce them. And you can see how this parameter here plays out. You will also notice that the clouds have the ability to fully cover the sun. So now the sun is completely hidden behind the clouds. You can have this cool effect where the clouds are moving in front of the sun, and then the sun sometimes peeks out and sometimes is hidden by the clouds. With the next parameter, the variety parameter, you can then further define the look of your clouds, and you can just play around until you have something that you like. Let me now move the sun up a little bit to show you the next parameter, the cirrus amount, and by this we can add some very far away clouds in our scene, which create this very nice parallax of this more closer clouds and then this very high and far away clouds. Speaking of height, we can define the height of our clouds, of course, so we can move them further to the ground or further into the sky. And we can also define the thickness of the clouds, for example, having them more thick or having them extremely thin. So there are really a lot of options on how you can define the look of your clouds. By animating the offset and phase parameters, you could even generate nice looking time lapses where the clouds are moving through the scene and at the same time the sun is moving towards the horizon. So in summary, the ability now to add clouds in your V-Ray Sun&Sky system is a really great option, and it oftentimes makes using traditional HDRIs totally obsolete, because using these kind of procedural clouds, you're much more flexible by being able to individually position your sun exactly where you want, position your clouds exactly where you want, and you don't have to rely on HDRIs anymore, where all of this kind of information is baked in. V-Ray 6 now comes with the Chaos Scatter plugin. With this plugin, we can distribute vegetation or other geometry in our scene in a procedural way. And we're going to use Chaos Scatter in order to add some kind of trees on our, at the moment, very empty looking island in here. So for this, we first need to have some trees that we want to distribute on this island. And I prepared some trees in my scene already, which all come from the Chaos Cosmos library. Now we need to add a new Chaos Scatter object. This we can do over the newly integrated toolbar up here. And then once we added this Chaos Scatter object, we can go to the Modifier tab. And then we need to add our distribution object. That would be this island. And then we also need to add our 3 different trees and distribute them on our island. We can then hide our original trees and then dive a little bit into those settings in here. At the moment we have way too many trees, and they also grow in places where we don't really want them to grow, for example also in these very steep areas. And by using these slope limitations we can define the areas where our trees are growing, and if I lower this value, for example, our trees will grow only in these kind of more flatter areas. By adding splines I can also further define where my trees are growing, and I have this hidden spline in here that I'm gonna unhide. And I will use this spline to kind of exclude this bay area where I also don't want to have any trees growing. And this I can do with the spline exclude. So once I add my spline, then the trees in this area would be excluded. In the transformations tab, I then can randomize, for example, my scale from between 50 to 150% of the trees. And that has the effect that some of the trees are bigger than other trees. And I can also do the same thing for my translation. For example, I can make the Z translation from -10 to 0. That means some trees are pushed up to 10 meters into the ground, and that makes them look a little bit more like bushes. The Z rotation is already randomized between 0 and 360 degrees. That means each tree by default already has its own unique rotation. The amount of trees we can define up here, and at the moment it's set at a fixed amount of 1000 trees, but we could decrease that, for example, to a lower amount, or also increase that if we want to. And if we don't want to set a fixed amount, we can also define the count per square meter. So now there would be 1 tree for every square meter. And that seems to be a little bit much, so let's make it 1 tree per 5 square meters. Then we can also raise our count again, so now it will be 3 trees per 5 square meters. And like this we can individually determine the right amount of trees. 𝐘𝐨𝐬, of course, has a lot more options than we have time for to explore now. If you want to check out more, there's also our own dedicated video about 𝐘𝐨𝐬 in my channel. All in all, I think 𝐘𝐨𝐬 is a great addition. In many cases, it makes the use of other external plugins such as Forest Pack and so on obsolete, because now in 𝐘𝐨𝐬 you will have all of the basic functions that you need, and it's also fully integrated and doesn't require an extra license. V-Ray 6 now comes with a new handy modifier called 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬, and in this scene I'm gonna demonstrate a little bit how it works. So what we have here is this kind of object, and I also generated this cloth simulation, so it basically wraps our object, and additionally I also prepared this small chainmail segment up here. So with 𝐓𝐴𝐿_Mesh I can use this cloth geometry and its UV coordinates to replace that with a repeating version of this chainmail segment. For this we just need to select our cloth object and then just add this VRayEnMesh modifier, and then also add our chainmail segment into it. Now we just need to restart our render to see the effect. Now you can see that our cloth surface has been replaced during render time with these chainmail segments, and now we can use those parameters in order to further define the result. With the U and V tiling, we can define the scale of our chainmail segments. Once I decrease them, you will see that these segments become a lot bigger. And now we can see that only one of the rings is intersecting with each other, and the other 4 rings are not really doing that. They are just touching each other. In order to solve this issue, we have to crop this chainmail object so that all of the rings can connect with each other seamlessly. And this, luckily, you can do directly in the 𝐓𝐴𝐿_Mesh modifier itself. So this crop box defines how you crop this chainmail segment, and you can also see a preview of it in the viewport. And then once you go lower here, for example, you can see that now this object here has been cropped, and you can get some interesting results with this, but we have to enter the correct values, and in my case that would be 5 centimeters up here, then 4.5 centimeters down here, and then we can see that all of those chainmails are now connecting seamlessly with each other. With this tiling of 2x2, it appears that our rings are a little bit flattened out, and that's where this height percentage comes into play. And in this situation, I might need to raise it so that the profile of each individual ring becomes circular again. With the height offset, I can also push all of those rings closer to the surface. For example, let's use a height offset of 0. And then in this case, they are even intersecting a bit with the surface. So let's choose a slightly higher value. And then I think it looks fine. Now to finalize the result, let's increase the tiling. And then we also might need to adjust this height parameter again to a value of 100, for example. And then we reach our final result. So all in all, the new 𝐓𝐴𝐿_Mesh modifier is a great tool to help us replace a surface based on the UV coordinates with a much more complex geometry during render time. And this kind of result would have been only possible to achieve by using way more complex methods in the past. So adding this new modifier to do that during the render time is a very welcome addition. So in V-Ray 6, V-Ray Decals now fully support displacement, and for this I set up this house wall that uses this V-Ray Displacement modifier, but instead of loading a texture map into the modifier, I just defined to use the object material. Then in the shader of the wall, I just use a displacement texture here in the displacement slot, and then by raising the value I can then define the strength of my displacement, and in this case I think a strength of 15 should be fine. Now my plan is to use this V-Ray decal in order to grow some ivy plants on the wall, and for this I set up already this shader, which I will now assign to the V-Ray decal itself. So the shader in here also uses displacement. This one has a value of 50. And then also in this mask option in the decal, I added the mask for the ivy texture in here. So having done that, we can then move our V-Ray decal in front of the house wall. And then we immediately have the effect of some nice ivy growing on the wall. And we can tell the fact that we're using displacement by observing our leaves, and we can see they each cast their own shadow. And if I would turn off the displacement, you can see the big difference that it makes. Because now these ivy leaves just appear like they are printed on the wall and not really growing in front of the wall. And with the support of displacement now and the V-Ray decal, you can get some much more realistic results. In V-Ray 6, for the V-Ray material, the subsurface scattering has been improved, and in order to check that out, let's enable subsurface scattering for this shader. Now we can see that in this illumination tab there's two different modes. One would be this directional mode, and that's how it was done in earlier versions, but the new mode is this uniform mode. And once we enable this, we can see it creates a slightly different look. It still looks like subsurface scattering, but it doesn't look totally identical to the directional mode, but it renders way faster than the previous mode. So let's quickly compare both shaders, and here we see the uniform mode, and this one would be the directional mode. And now it's great to have two different modes for different kind of situations, because while the directional mode sometimes can give you the more realistic result because it also takes the directionality of the light source into account, and this way you can have, for example, shadows continuous scattering beneath the surface. It comes on the expense of render time, and also it's very dependent on your geometry. So if you have, for example, low poly geometry, then this directional mode can give you some problems. So having this new uniform mode oftentimes is totally enough to get some nice subsurface scattering result. Also new is that the subsurface scattering amount and the scale allow a map input, and with this you can get some very nice results. For example, here I have a simple noise prepared, and then let's just put this noise into the scale. And then we have the effect that certain parts of our model have a deeper subsurface scattering, while others have a more shallow subsurface scattering. And by this you can get some very nice results. So in summary, with the update of the subsurface scattering, it allows for way greater flexibility by having two different modes. And also because these values here allow now a map input, you can also generate much more realistic results. In V-Ray 6, the V-Ray material received a new option, which is called the thin film, and that's a very handy addition in order to generate certain kind of shaders, such as soap bubbles, oil spills, and so on, because it will offset the reflection color based on the surface angle. And in this scene here, we're gonna try this out on this soap bubbles, where we're gonna use the thin film in order to generate this kind of effect. So before we enable the thin film, it's important to know that it's mixed together with your traditional reflection. And in order to not get confused what the thin film is doing exactly, I just unlinked the Fresnel IOR, and now we'll just put this value to a value of 1. So we temporarily disable all of the traditional reflections. And now we can just easily enable the thin film and then see what this is doing by itself. As you can see, the thin film kind of offsets the reflection colors. Now it's a little bit bluish and has some purple colors. And with this min thickness value, we can easily offset these colors even more until we reach some result that we want. You will notice that there's also a max thickness value. And once you play around with this, you will see that there's actually no effect here. And the reason for that is that this max thickness only comes into play once you add a map into the input here. So now let's find out how we can use a map for this input. And at the moment we just have this very smooth, simple transition from the outside to the inside. And in reality, this kind of transition is broken up a little bit. And there's this kind of like random patterns in here. And for this, I generated this kind of simple noise map, just a fractal noise with black and white. And now we can just copy this noise and then go back into our thin film and then also add this into this map input. So now you can see that the result changed a little bit already. And now the max thickness defines our effect in the white part of the noise. And the min thickness defines the effect in the black part of the noise. So we can dial, for example, here different values than for the max thickness. And now you can see that the reflection colors are broken up in a slightly different way. And we have these interesting patterns here going on. So now as a last step, we could then slowly raise our IOR again in order to mix both type of reflections together again. And by this way, you can also see that the thin film effect will become a little bit less prominent. So in summary, while those type of effects were also possible in earlier versions using more complicated workflows, the new thin film feature is a very welcome addition because now it just makes this kind of process way simpler and also easier to adjust. So V-Ray 6 offers an updated model for the energy preservation for its shaders. In this simple scene, we're going to check out the difference to the previous version. So what we have here is 3 different shaders. At the first line, we have some metallic shader. At the second line, some refractive shader. And at the third line, some dielectric material. And then we have an increasing amount of roughness from left to right for each shader. So right now you can see the new energy preservation model already, and I want you to notice especially the shaders on the right hand side because those are the more rougher versions of this shader. And now I will switch to the previous model, and you can see that especially these kind of very rough shaders now are rendered correctly. And in earlier versions, in this one here for example, it looks like the shader becomes more dark, especially for this metallic shader here, and also a little bit for this dielectric material. And now you can see that the energy with the new model is correctly preserved. Luckily, everything stays downwards compatible. That means if you have a scene or a shader from an earlier V-Ray version, then V-Ray 6 will also render that with the earlier energy preservation model. And only if you create a new shader from scratch, the new energy preservation model will be applied. Let's finally check out some improvements that were done in the V-Ray frame buffer. And let's start with the new proportion guide. And this one helps you to determine the right composition for your image. Inside there's already a couple of predefined rules. For example, we have the rule of thirds. And then you can choose a different line width if you want to, and also a different kind of color if you need to. So there's the rule of thirds, there's diagonals, there's a golden ratio, there's a center cross, and if you want to define your own custom grid, you can also do this here where you define your rows and columns. So in summary, the new proportion guide is a nice little helper to evaluate your composition. Another nice feature is the new integrated panorama view, and in this scene I rendered a 360 degrees panorama, and now the frame buffer offers the possibility to see this already directly in the frame buffer as a panorama by just switching to this panorama view in here. Once you do this, you can move around in the frame buffer with the arrow keys to preview your panorama, and you can also use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out. So if you're working a lot with panoramas, this will be a very helpful feature for you to preview those panoramas and can save you a lot of work always going back and forth. Finally, we will check out the new collaboration option, and with this we can upload images like this one directly to the Chaos Cloud and then share them with clients or other team members, and they can then leave comments or improvement suggestions in there. So in order to do that, you just switch to this collaboration tab and then just prepare to upload this image here. And then once you did this, you can then define different kind of projects. I already predefined a test project and then just upload this image to there. And then we can directly view that in the Chaos Cloud. So then in the Chaos Cloud, I can see all of the pictures that were uploaded to this project. Then I can either share the whole project, also just individual images, and I can share them by either entering email addresses here or by generating a link and then sending this link to other people. I can also define if people can just view or even edit the image, and editing means that you can leave comments on the image. For example, I can choose to add a comment here that the sky is too green, and then this comment would be added and other people can also reply to that or give other kind of suggestions. If I uploaded the panorama like this one, I can then also go into this information tab and then just make sure that this panorama mode here is switched on, and then you can immediately navigate through the panorama the same way like you could do in the V-Ray frame buffer. So in summary, the new collaboration feature can help with the communication with clients or other team members, and it makes sharing images quite easy. So this, in my view, are the most important features for V-Ray 6. Of course, there's additional features. You can check them out on the 𝐘𝐨𝐻 website. And if you watch this video until here, chances are that you also enjoy the content that I provide over on my Patreon, where you can download scene files, additional bonus videos, or even whole rendering courses. I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care.